The sharp, acrid smell of chlorine hit me first, a chemical scream that sliced through the warm afternoon air, and the sound of children's laughter. It was the scent of industrial-strength bleach, a concentration far too high for domestic use. And it was coming from the direction of the small, inflatable kiddie pool set up on our front lawn. My daughter Maya and her best friend Chloe were in that pool, their shrieks of joy abruptly turning into panicked coughs and sputtering cries. I saw her then, a woman from down the street standing over the pool, with a large, white plastic jug tipped in her hands. A thick, glugging stream of liquid poured into the shallow water where the two 6-year-old girls were playing. Just a little disinfection. She called out, her voice a bizarre cocktail of cheerful pleasantry and chilling fanaticism. Can't be too careful. We need to keep things clean. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing all at once. My brain, the brain of the State Director of Environmental Health, was already performing a frantic, involuntary toxicological assessment. The volume of the pool, the approximate flow rate from the jug, the rapid off-gassing of chlorine vapor, the immediate danger of chemical burns to the skin, severe irritation to the eyes, and catastrophic damage to the delicate tissues of the lungs. But the father's brain, the father's heart, simply screamed. "Get out! Get out of the pool now!" I roared, sprinting across the lawn, my feet barely touching the grass. The girls were already scrambling, their small bodies clumsy with panic, crying as they slipped on the slick vinyl. Chloe's mother, Sarah, who had been sitting with me on the porch, was right behind me, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. The woman, whose name I knew was Barbara, took a self-satisfied step back, placing the bleach jug on the grass, as if she had just performed a helpful community service. "There now," she said, smiling brightly. "All clean." I didn't spare her a glance. My focus was entirely on the children. I grabbed Maya, my arms wrapping around her small wet body, and pulled her away from the toxic cloud hanging over the water. Sarah did the same with Chloe. The girls were coughing violently, their eyes red and streaming with tears. "It stings, Daddy. It stings," Maya cried, rubbing her face, a gesture I knew would only make it worse. "Don't rub your eyes, sweetie. Don't rub them," I said, my voice tight with a control I did not feel. My mind was already cycling through emergency protocols. Decontamination, irrigation, medical assessment. "Sarah, get them to the emergency shower in my garage. Now, strip them down and irrigate with cool water. Eyes first, then full body. At least 15 minutes. I'll be right there." Sarah, a nurse, nodded immediately, her training kicking in. She herded the weeping, coughing children towards the side of the house, without a second's hesitation. Only then did I turn to face the woman. Barbara. She stood there, a pleasant, expectant look on her face, as if waiting for a thank you. The sheer, unadulterated madness of it was breathtaking. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice dangerously low, stripped of all emotion. "I told you. I disinfected it," she replied, her tone laced with a hint of condescension, as if I were a bit slow on the uptake. "Those inflatable pools are breeding grounds for all sorts of filth. I'm on the HOA board, you know. We have a responsibility to maintain health standards in the community." "That was a gallon of undiluted industrial-grade sodium hypochlorite," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as broken glass. "The permissible concentration of free chlorine for a swimming pool is between 1 and 4 parts per million. You introduced a concentration that was likely in the thousands. You have just created a chemical hazard. You have just committed a chemical assault on 2 6-year-old children." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, the first crack in her armor of self-righteousness. "Well, I'm sure that's an exaggeration. More is better when it comes to germs." "That's not how toxicology works," I snapped, taking a step towards her. The rage I had been suppressing was beginning to boil over. "You expose them to a caustic agent that can cause severe burns, blindness, and pulmonary edema. You did this deliberately, maliciously." I gestured towards my daughter and her friend. "Because they are black. Barbara gasped, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of theatrical offense. That is a monstrous accusation. This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with hygiene. The word hygiene dripped with a venomous implication that was impossible to miss. Her eyes flickered over my house, my lawn, my family with a look of profound distaste. The connection was undeniable, a disgusting racist trope masquerading as a public health concern. I pulled out my phone. I am Dr. Marcus Thorne. I am the Director of Environmental Health for this state. I am an expert in chemical hazards and exposure events. And I am placing you under citizen's arrest for aggravated assault with a chemical agent and reckless endangerment of a child. Her jaw dropped. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty mottled fear. You can't. You're not a police officer. In the event of a direct threat to public health and safety, my authority allows me to detain an individual responsible for a hazardous materials incident until law enforcement arrives. I informed her, the words of the state health code echoing in my mind. I was already dialing 911, my thumb pressing the screen with steady, deliberate force. You are that individual. The bleach is that incident. Do not move. Do not say another word. Barbara stood frozen, the half-empty jug of bleach standing on the grass beside her, like a tombstone, marking the end of her life as she knew it. She looked at me, truly, looked at me for the first time, and the smug confidence in her eyes was replaced by a dawning, abject terror. She hadn't just poured bleach into a kiddie pool. She had, through an act of supreme ignorance and prejudice, just declared war on the one man in the entire state who was uniquely professionally and personally equipped to make her pay for it in the most precise and devastating way imaginable. The battle for my children's safety and for the soul of our neighborhood had just begun. My life was a carefully balanced equation of science and love. By day, I navigated a world of invisible threats. I was the man the governor called when a chemical plant exploded, when a town's water supply was contaminated, when a mysterious illness cluster appeared in a rural county. My job was to trace the source, to quantify the risk, to separate fact from fear, and to protect the public from the myriad ways the modern world could poison them. My office was a sterile, quiet space of data reports and regulations. I spoke in parts per million in exposure pathways, in statistical certainties. But when I came home, I stepped into a different world, one filled with the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful mess of raising a 6-year-old girl. Our house was a sanctuary I had built for Maya after my wife Eleanor had died in a car accident 3 years prior. Eleanor had been an artist, a woman who saw the world in color and texture, and I had tried to keep her spirit alive in our home. Her paintings adorned the walls, bright splashes of life against the calm, neutral tones I preferred. I had learned to bake her favorite chocolate chip cookies, to braid Maya's hair, to navigate the complex social politics of playdates and birthday parties. I was a man of science, but being Maya's father had taught me the limits of data. It had taught me about a different kind of chemistry, the alchemy of a child's laughter, the specific gravity of a tear, the unbreakable molecular bond between a parent and a child. Protecting her was the most critical mission of my life. I had baby-proofed the house with the same meticulous attention to detail I would use to secure a hazardous waste site. We had organic food, a state-of-the-art air filtration system, and a water purification setup that was probably overkill for a suburban home. I controlled every variable I could to keep her safe. We had moved to the Oak Haven subdivision 6 months ago, drawn by the promise of good schools, quiet streets, and a strong sense of community. It was a picture-perfect neighborhood with manicured lawns, mature oak trees, and a palpable sense of order. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, and children rode their bikes in the street until dusk. But beneath the pristine surface, I had quickly discovered a rigid, unspoken social code, and its primary enforcer was the president of the Homeowners Association, Barbara Johnson. Barbara was a woman who seemed to be perpetually wound just a little too tight. She was a widow in her late 50s who patrolled the neighborhood in her golf cart, a clipboard, and a measuring tape, always at the ready. She was infamous for issuing violation notices for trash cans left out an hour too long for grass, that was a quarter of an inch too high for holiday decorations that did not conform to the approved color palette. Her obsession, however, was with cleanliness. She wrote long hectoring posts on the community's online forum about the dangers of germs, the importance of hand sanitizer, and the proper way to disinfect mailboxes. Most people treated her as a harmless, if annoying, eccentric. I had seen something else in her eyes during our few brief interactions, a glint of something obsessive and deeply unsettled. The inciting incident, the Bleach attack, was the moment her private pathology became a public menace. It was the horrific manifestation of a prejudice she had cloaked in the language of hygiene. She didn't see two little girls playing in the water. She saw a contamination, a source of filth that needed to be scoured and bleached from her perfect, orderly world. The fact that these contaminants were black children was in my mind no coincidence. It was the core of her delusion. She had unleashed her weapon of purification on my daughter, and in doing so, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had brought the invisible threats I fought every day at work directly to my front lawn, and the full weight of my knowledge, my authority, and my fury was about to come crashing down upon her. The arrival of the police and paramedics transformed our quiet suburban street into a flashing, chaotic emergency scene. I gave a calm, precise statement to the first responding officer detailing the event, with the dispassionate clarity of a field report. I handed him the bleach jug, sealed in a biohazard evidence bag I kept in my garage, for just such work-related eventualities. I am always prepared. Inside, Sarah had finished decontaminating the girls. They were wrapped in large fluffy towels, their skin pink, and scrubbed, their eyes still red, but no longer in acute distress. The lingering smell of chlorine clung to the air in the bathroom, a sickening reminder of the assault. Maya was quiet, her small body trembling slightly as she clung to me. Chloe was crying softly, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. The psychological trauma I knew would last far longer than the physical irritation. Barbara was taken into custody, her face a mask of shocked indignation, still protesting that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the rising action had already begun its tendrils reaching out from my front lawn and into the wider community. The first counterattack came swiftly. After being charged with 2 counts of felony chemical assault and child endangerment, Barbara was released on bail. The very next morning, the Oak Haven online forum was on fire. Her version of the story spread like a virus. In her telling, she was the victim. She was a benevolent neighbor who had noticed a murky, dirty pool, and using a common household cleaning product, had simply tried to help. She claimed I had exploded in a fit of rage, physically threatening her, and using my government position to orchestrate a false arrest. Her post was a masterclass in racist dog whistling. She spoke of certain families who didn't understand our community's standards of upkeep and hygiene. She lamented the changing character of the neighborhood. A significant portion of the residents' people who had chafed under her petty tyranny, but were now swayed by her victim narrative, rallied to her side. They accused me of being an arrogant outsider, of playing the race card, of being an oversensitive parent who couldn't take a well-intentioned suggestion. My family was being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, and the jury was a mob of my own neighbors. The second escalation was a direct and deeply personal abuse of her power as HOA president. A week after the incident, a certified letter arrived. The HOA board, at an emergency session led by Barbara, had passed a new bylaw. Citing environmental and safety concerns, the new rule prohibited the installation or use of any non-standard private water filtration or air purification systems without a special permit from the board. The bylaw was written with such specific technical language that it could only possibly apply to one house mine. It was a blatant act of retaliation, a direct assault on the very systems I had installed to protect my daughter. They were threatening to force me to dismantle the equipment that ensured the purity of the air Maya breathed and the water she drank. It was a cruel, legalistic maneuver designed to make our home uninhabitable for someone with my standards of safety, to legislate us out of the neighborhood. The message was clear: if we couldn't be bleached out, we would be regulated out. They were attacking my expertise, turning my own professional domain into a weapon against me. The bullying then escalated to a chilling new level of psychological warfare. Barbara organized a neighborhood health and safety watch. In practice, this meant that she and her coterie of supporters began a campaign of constant, low-grade surveillance. They would park their golf carts across the street from my house for hours, ostensibly observing. They would take pictures with their cell phones whenever I came outside, whenever Maya tried to play in the yard, whenever we had visitors. They started a log documenting every perceived infraction. A package left on the porch for too long, a visitor's car parked a few inches too close to a driveway. They filed a series of frivolous complaints against me with the state health board, questioning my professional conduct and accusing me of using my position to harass a private citizen. It was a war of attrition designed to exhaust me, to isolate me, to bury me in a mountain of paperwork and legal challenges. They were trying to create a hostile environment to make every moment in my own home feel fraught with tension and scrutiny. They were trying to break me, but they had fundamentally misjudged their opponent. I was a man who had spent his entire career staring down invisible threats. I knew how to collect data, how to document evidence, and how to build a case with meticulous, undeniable precision. They thought they were waging a neighborhood dispute. I knew I was gathering the evidence for a federal civil rights lawsuit. They were bringing picket signs and bylaws to a chemical warfare fight, and they had no idea the arsenal I was preparing to unleash. The midpoint of this nightmare arrived not with a single dramatic revelation, but through a slow, methodical investigation that began in the sterile archives of my own department. I was looking for leverage, for a way to understand the obsessive, pathological nature of Barbara's crusade against me. What drove a person to such a dangerous extreme? Detective Miller, the lead investigator on the criminal case, was building a solid assault charge, but he was focused on the event itself. I needed to understand the motive, the history. I needed to know why. I started with Barbara herself. A background check revealed a life of quiet, upper-middle-class privilege. But one detail stood out: a tragedy tucked away in the public records of a neighboring county, the death of her only child, a 10-year-old son named Daniel, 15 years ago. The cause of death was listed as septic shock, secondary to a waterborne bacterial infection. The phrase, waterborne bacterial infection, set off alarm bells in my head. It was the language of my world. Using my credentials, I began to dig, cross-referencing state health records from that year. I founded a small, localized outbreak of a particularly virulent strain of Pseudomonas aeruginosa, a bacterium that thrives in contaminated water. The outbreak had been confined to a single affluent community called Whispering Pines, about 30 miles from Oak Haven. There were 5 confirmed cases, all children. 4 had recovered. 1 had died. Daniel Johnson. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a random tragedy. This was a specific public health failure. I pulled the original investigation file, a thick, dusty binder that hadn't been opened in over a decade. The lead investigator on the case had been my predecessor at the State Environmental Health Department, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, who had retired under a cloud of rumors about his cozy relationships with corporate developers. The file was a study in deliberate incompetence. The investigation had been cursory, the water testing inadequate. Finch's official conclusion was that the source of the bacteria was unidentifiable, likely stemming from a natural environmental source, like a creek or pond the children had played in. Case closed. It felt wrong. Pseudomonas outbreaks of that nature are rarely natural. They are almost always linked to a failure in a man-made water system, a contaminated well, a poorly maintained public pool, a faulty municipal water line. The key that unlocked everything, was buried deep in the appendices of the report. It was a series of internal memos between Finch and the lawyers for a company called Clarity Development, the corporation that had built the Whispering Pines subdivision. The memos revealed that Clarity had conducted its own private water testing after the outbreak and had found massive contamination in the community's primary well, the source of all its drinking water. The contamination was traced back to illegal dumping of industrial waste from a nearby manufacturing plant that Clarity also owned. They had found the source, they knew, and they had buried it. Alistair Finch, the head of the state agency tasked with protecting public health, had conspired with a corporate developer to conceal a finding of gross negligence that had led to the death of a child. They had covered it up to avoid a massive lawsuit and a corporate scandal. And Barbara Johnson had spent the last 15 years living in the shadow of that lie. Her son hadn't died from some random act of nature. He had been killed by corporate greed and government corruption. Her entire life, her obsessive-compulsive focus on cleanliness and hygiene, her pathological fear of germs, her distrust of outsiders, it was all a symptom of a profound, unresolved trauma. She had been searching for a villain, a source for the contamination that stole her son, and she had never found one. Her grief had curdled into a free-floating paranoia and rage that she projected onto the world. Then, I moved into her neighborhood, not just as a black man and outsider in her racially homogeneous world, but as the new director of the very state agency that had betrayed her. When she discovered my title, it must have been like a thunderclap in her fractured mind. To her, I wasn't just a new neighbor. I was the embodiment of the system that had failed her, the face of the vast, powerful conspiracy she had always suspected, but could never prove. Her attack on my daughter wasn't just racism, though it was certainly that. It was a deeply twisted, misdirected act of transference, a strike against the man she saw as the heir to the corrupt system that had destroyed her life. I now held the key, not just to her motive, but to a 15-year-old crime. The fight was no longer just about protecting my family from a neighborhood tyrant. It was about exposing a dark secret and delivering a justice that was long tragically overdue. My personal battle had just intersected with my professional duty in the most profound way imaginable. I had the power to destroy Barbara with the truth, but it was a truth far more complex and devastating than anyone could have imagined. The upcoming HOA meeting was Barbara's chosen stage for my public execution. The agenda emailed to the entire community was a thinly veiled indictment of my family. It listed a vote on the enforcement of bylaw, 7.4 unauthorized systems, a review of community safety protocols, and an open forum on maintaining neighborhood standards. She intended to use her carefully cultivated mob to revoke my water filtration system, to formalize her Neighborhood Watch into an official HOA-sanctioned surveillance program, and to publicly shame me into leaving Oak Haven. She saw it as her final victory. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush. Armed with the Whispering Pines file, I worked with a quiet, furious intensity. I contacted Detective Miller and laid out the entire sordid history. The revelation of a motive rooted in a potential government cover-up transformed his assault case into something much larger. He immediately began coordinating with the state attorney general's office. I also reached out to the 4 other families from the Whispering Pines outbreak, the ones whose children had survived. They had been told the same lie as Barbara, that the source was untraceable. Their relief at finally knowing the truth was quickly replaced by a cold, hard anger. They agreed to attend the meeting. The night of the HOA meeting, the community center's conference room was packed, the air thick with a toxic mix of self-righteousness, fear, and morbid curiosity. Barbara and her supporters sat at the front, arranged like a tribunal. My small group of allies, Sarah, a few other supportive neighbors, and now the families from Whispering Pines sat together, a small island of grim resolve in a sea of hostility. I entered last, walking to my seat with a heavy briefcase in my hand. Maya was safe at home with a trusted sitter. This was not a place for a child. Barbara, radiating a triumphant confidence, called the meeting to order. She delivered a smug, meandering speech about the importance of rules vigilance and protecting the character of their community. She methodically went through her agenda, her voice dripping with false concern, as she detailed my violations. The vote to force me to remove my filtration system passed with an overwhelming majority. Her supporters applauded. Finally, she opened the floor. The floor is now open for a discussion on how we can ensure Oak Haven remains a safe and clean community for everyone. Her eyes locked on me, a clear challenge. This was my cue. I walked to the podium, placing my briefcase on its surface. The room fell silent. My name is Dr. Marcus Thorne. I began, my voice calm and clear, amplified by the microphone. You have all just voted to remove the water filtration system from my home. I want to tell you why that system is there. I want to tell you about a place called Whispering Pines. I saw a flicker of confusion in Barbara's eyes, quickly suppressed. 15 years ago, I continued, there was a tragic outbreak in the Whispering Pines subdivision. 5 children became critically ill from a waterborne bacterial infection. One of them died. I looked directly at Barbara. Her face had gone pale. The triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stark, raw pain. That child's name was Daniel Johnson. He was Barbara's son. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the room. The hostile faces of her supporters softened with confusion. This was not the script they had been given. The official investigation at the time, conducted by my predecessor at the State Environmental Health Department, concluded that the source was untraceable. That was a lie. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the thick bound file. I held it up for all to see. This is the original case file, a file that I, as the current director, have unsealed. It contains proof that the developer of Whispering Pines knew the communities well, was contaminated with industrial waste. It contains proof that they conspired with the state investigator to bury that finding, to protect their profits, and to avoid accountability for the death of a 10-year-old boy. I let the weight of my words sink in. Your son wasn't killed by a random germ, Barbara. He was poisoned by corporate negligence, and the government agency I now lead helped cover it up. Barbara stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake. She was trembling, her hands gripping the table in front of her. No! She whispered the word, a ragged, desperate plea. No, you're lying. Am I? I turned to the back of the room. Would Mrs. and Mr. Gennaro please stand up? An older couple rose, their faces etched with grief. Their daughter Maria was one of the other children who fell ill. They were told the same lie you were, as were the Costas, as were the Lees. One by one, the other families from Whispering Pines stood, a silent, powerful testament to the shared hidden tragedy. The room was in stunned silence. The narrative had been shattered. Barbara was no longer a vigilant community protector. She was a tragic figure, her rage and prejudice the twisted symptoms of a monumental injustice. Your grief is unimaginable, Barbara, I said, my voice softening slightly. But in your pain, you looked for contamination everywhere. You became obsessed with a phantom threat, and that obsession, that pain, twisted itself into prejudice. You looked at my daughter, at a child playing in a pool on a summer day, and you didn't see a little girl. You saw a source of filth that you needed to eradicate. You took your justifiable rage at a system that failed you, and you aimed it at my innocent child. At that moment, the doors to the conference room swung open. Detective Miller entered along with 2 uniformed officers and a stern-faced woman from the Attorney General's office. Barbara Johnson. Detective Miller said, his voice resonating through the silent room. "This meeting is over. Based on new evidence and testimony, we are filing additional charges against you, including multiple counts of harassment and witness intimidation. But more importantly," he gestured to the woman from the AG's office, "the state is officially reopening the investigation into the death of Daniel Johnson and the Whispering Pines contamination event." Barbara let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. It was the sound of a life breaking apart, of 15 years of rage and grief, finally colliding with a devastating truth. Her supporters, the people who had been her army just minutes before, stared at her with a mixture of pity and horror. They had been pawns in a game far darker than they had ever imagined. The meeting she had designed to be my humiliation had become her own cataclysmic unmasking, a climax that offered not victory, but a terrible soul-shattering clarity. The aftermath of the meeting was a swift and decisive tide of justice. Barbara Johnson was arrested, her face on the local news, no longer as a concerned HOA president, but as a disgraced woman at the center of two separate criminal investigations. The felony assault charges for the attack on Maya and Chloe were now bolstered by a clear, documented pattern of harassment and a psychologically complex motive that dismantled any possible defense of a misunderstanding. Faced with a mountain of evidence, she ultimately pleaded guilty, her public downfall complete and absolute. Her sentence included prison time, mandatory psychological treatment, and a permanent restraining order, keeping her away from my family and Chloe's. Simultaneously, the Attorney General's investigation into the Whispering Pines cover-up exploded into a massive public scandal. My predecessor, Alistair Finch, was indicted, as were the executives of Clarity Development. The story of corporate greed and government corruption that led to the death of a child and the suffering of 4 others became a statewide cautionary tale. Justice, 15 years delayed, was finally being served. For the families of Whispering Pines, it was a painful but validating resolution. For Barbara, it was a bitter irony. The truth she had been subconsciously seeking for years was revealed at the cost of her own freedom, a truth unearthed by the very man she had tried to destroy. The resolution for Oak Haven was a period of profound soul-searching. The HOA, exposed as a vehicle for one woman's pathology and the community's passive prejudice, was unceremoniously dismantled by a near-unanimous vote of the residents. The ridiculous bylaws, including the one targeting my filtration systems, were voided. The atmosphere of suspicion and petty tyranny was replaced by a chastened and humbled quiet. People who had eagerly joined Barbara's online mob now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact, their shame palpable. But shame can also be a catalyst for growth. A new community association was formed, its charter explicitly focused on inclusivity, transparency, and mutual respect. Sarah, Chloe's mother, was elected its first president. One of their first projects was to use the now-defunct HOA's reserve funds to build a new community pool, a state-of-the-art facility with a cutting-edge saline filtration system and a prominent plaque dedicating it to the safety and enjoyment of all our children. The ending for my own small family was a slow return to peace, but a new kind of peace, one that was deeper and more resilient than before. The invisible threats had become visible, confronted, and defeated. Maya, with the help of a wonderful child therapist, began to process her trauma. Her fear of water slowly subsided, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Several months later, on a sun-drenched Saturday, I sat on a lounge chair at the new Oak Haven community pool. The air smelled of sunscreen and clean, fresh water, not of bleach. I watched Maya and Chloe splashing in the shallow end, their laughter echoing in the bright afternoon. Maya swam over to the edge where I was sitting, her face beaming. "Look, Daddy, I can hold my breath for 10 seconds, she announced proudly before disappearing under the sparkling blue water. I watched her, a small, perfect girl in a world that I had fought to make safe for her. The battle had been horrific, a journey into the heart of a darkness I never expected to find on my own doorstep. But we had emerged from it, not unscathed, but stronger. We had exposed a truth, brought justice to the wronged, and helped a community find its way back from the brink. The equation of my life was still balanced between science and love, but I now understood their relationship in a new way. Love was not just an emotion to be protected by the walls of science. It was a force that could fuel the search for truth, a catalyst that could demand justice, a light bright enough to disinfect even the darkest corners of the human heart. And in the sound of my daughter's joyful laughter, I knew with a certainty that surpassed any scientific data that we were finally truly home.